And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. What if the crisis isn't that young people aren't reaching out, but that they no longer remember how? Not because the desire is gone, but because the grammar of approach has been unlearned. In a culture where contact has been flattened into connection and intimacy redesigned as interaction, something quieter has eroded the ability to begin. This essay traces that erosion, not as a failure of courage, but as a shift in structure. It asks what disappears when proximity replaces presence, when preference replaces pause, and when initiation itself becomes anachronistic. At stake is more than romance, it's the relational fabric by which we become. A child stands at the edge of a school hallway, holding a birthday invitation. It's just a piece of paper, small, glossy, already curling at the corners, but in that moment it weighs more than it should. To cross the floor, to hand it over, is to risk something disproportionate to the act: embarrassment, rejection, or worse, indifference. And yet, in some version of the world not yet automated out of us, the child steps forward. There's no script, no app, just the attempt. That movement, hesitant, hopeful, isn't about the party. It's about what it means to reach across the gap between selves without knowing what will happen. We don't do that as much anymore. Not because we've lost interest in each other, but because we've lost practice. Where there was once space for uncertainty, we now have scaffolding. Profiles, bios, filters, red flags. We front-load ourselves with information in the hope that it will eliminate risk, forgetting that risk was how we once became real to each other. The modern self curates rather than reveals, optimizes rather than opens. But a self that cannot be refused cannot be received either. It only circulates, gleaming but untouched. Initiation, those small, awkward first moves, isn't ancillary to connection. It is the connection. The stumble, the pause, the half-sentence that turns into something truer than we meant. It's there that recognition lives. Not in the polished overture, but in the unscripted moment where two people discover they are not machines. Technology did not steal this from us maliciously. It offered us ease. We accepted, but something was lost in the trade. The necessity of courage and the subtle texture of mutual risk. This isn't nostalgia, it's anatomy. Humans are formed not just by their preferences, but by the acts that test them. To want is not enough. To approach is to be seen wanting. And that is the start of any real encounter. Without it, we slip into a culture of approximation, where nearness is mistaken for nearness and presence for profile. The invitation never leaves the child's hand. The hallway remains uncrossed, and we mistake that stillness for safety when it may be the shape of loss. So much of who we are is not what we feel, but what we risk letting others feel in us. That's not just social, it's spiritual, not just relational, foundational, because without the tremble of approach, we don't connect, we orbit. And an orbit, no matter how stable, is still a kind of loneliness. It begins with small substitutions. A glance becomes a swipe, a hello becomes a like. The distance between two people is now measured not in steps, but in screens. And yet we feel closer than ever. Notifications mimic attention. Presence is simulated in pings. But something doesn't land. There is a kind of hunger that persists even after every message is answered. Because what we're missing isn't connection, it's contact. The unscripted nearness of being seen before we've rehearsed who to be. The platforms were designed to remove friction, but friction was never the enemy. Friction is what happens when two surfaces meet. It's heat, resistance, texture. In human terms, it's the awkwardness of meeting someone's eyes, the pause before you speak, the tremor in your voice when you don't know how you'll be received. That discomfort wasn't failure. It was fidelity. It meant the interaction was real. Now, we scroll through each other like catalogues, each gesture buffered by interface. The encounter is managed, delayed, deferred, and so the moment never quite arrives. What we gain in efficiency, we lose in emergence. The unexpected kindness, the surprising reaction, the moment that doesn't fit a pattern. Algorithms optimize for preference, not possibility. They cannot account for the beauty of being wrong about someone or the quiet transformation that follows. In automating our entrances into each other's lives, we forget that the very act of entering, clumsy, bold, unrehearsed, was where the meaning lived. It's not that people don't want to reach out, it's that they no longer know how to begin. Initiation has become an act without grammar. The cues have shifted, the rituals unlearned. What once required presence now demands strategy. What once invited risk now calculates return. And so we wait and wait, hoping someone else will go first, not realizing that everyone is hoping the same. The result is a collective hesitation, a shared silence mistaken for disinterest. But underneath the performance, there is still the pulse, the desire to be chosen not for compatibility but for courage, to be the one someone crossed a room for, even when they didn't have the words. And maybe that's the shape of what we've lost. Not connection, but the conditions under which connection becomes sacred. Not contact, but the contact that costs something. That leaves a mark that asks us to be more than efficient, to be here, trembling together. There was a time when approach was an art, unspoken, improvisational, built from the materials at hand. A glance at a bookstore, a shared bench at a bus stop, a question asked not because it was clever but because it opened a door. These were not grand declarations. They were small acts of presence, lived in the body before they were shaped by language. Today, these openings are filtered through scripts and screens, their stakes diluted, their spontaneity managed. We've retained the vocabulary of closeness but not its grammar. At the centre of this shift is a misreading of what intimacy requires. Not information, but initiative. Not perfect timing, but imperfect presence. The algorithms don't understand this because they're built to deliver compatibility, not chemistry. They assume desire is logical, that it can be predicted, matched, optimized. But real closeness resists calibration. It isn't a function of shared interests or symmetrical bios. It emerges in the moment someone says something slightly off, slightly vulnerable, and the other person doesn't look away. That asymmetry, the courage to show more than is requested, is what creates the conditions for mutuality. And it is precisely what our systems now protect us from. We are buffered from rejection, yes, but also from recognition, because to be truly seen is to be slightly out of control. Not curated, not certain, not defended, just present. The invitation is not just to be liked, but to be known, and that cannot happen without friction. This erosion of embodied initiation has a cost beyond dating. It rewires our capacity to act without outcome, to offer without return. We become transactional, not because we're shallow, but because the systems we inhabit reward it. In a marketplace, every gesture is an investment, but human connection is not a market, it's a field. And fields don't grow on efficiency, they grow on attention, timing, and the unpredictability of weather. To approach someone in real life without preamble or profile is to enact a quiet defiance. It is to say, I am willing to be changed by this, not persuaded, not improved, just affected. That's the kind of openness our platforms can't simulate, and maybe shouldn't, because what makes it sacred is not that it always works, but that it could have gone another way. That someone showed up anyway, that someone risked the mess of beginning. Consider the ethics of hesitation. Not the strategic pause of someone trying to calculate an outcome, but the genuine pause of someone letting another person arrive fully before responding. In face-to-face interaction, this kind of pause is felt, not just heard. It creates a space where presence precedes performance. You don't need to know what to say, you just need to stay. Online, that pause doesn't exist. Silence is either seen as disinterest or disappears into the void. We are not allowed to wait. We are asked to decide now with data, but not with depth. This is not a crisis of technology. It's a crisis of initiation. And initiation is not solved by improving our interfaces, but by reclaiming our intervals. Those quiet moments where two people don't yet know what they are to each other, but agree, wordlessly, to find out. They are the breathing space of becoming. Without them, we default to the path of least resistance. Matching over meeting, signaling over seeking, sorting over staying. And we wonder why we feel so distant even when we're constantly surrounded by messages. In some cultures, initiation rituals were deliberately difficult, not to gatekeep, but to prepare, to signal that entering into relation requires transformation. We've kept the notion of readiness, be your best self, be healed, be whole, but remove the context in which readiness becomes meaningful, the encounter, because only in contact do we discover the difference between who we imagined we were and who we are in relation. Without that mirror of response, we become stuck in idealized isolation, endlessly refining an image no one ever really touches. The artistry of approach doesn't lie in confidence. It lies in the willingness to not be received as expected. It is, in some sense, a spiritual act, not religious, but reverent, an act of offering without demand. And this offering isn't always smooth. Sometimes it's halting, poorly timed, misread. But the effort itself carries an ethical charge. It says, I believe something meaningful could emerge here, even if I can't predict or control it. That's the essence of presence. Not that it guarantees connection, but that it risks disruption. The possibility that something unplanned could arise, that we might be surprised by the other, by ourselves, by the world. And in that surprise, a kind of grace, the kind you can't scroll to, the kind you have to stumble into with both hands slightly open, not knowing what they'll hold. To restore this art of approach, we must begin not with advice, but with attention, not to what others want, but to what we've stopped noticing in ourselves, the flicker before a gesture, the pull toward another, the instinct to reach that's been dulled by deferral. The systems we inhabit have trained us to hesitate, not out of humility, but out of design. Risk has become inefficient, vulnerability unscalable. And yet, these are the conditions under which the human heart begins to articulate itself. Every frictionless interaction is a lesson unlearned. How to read a glance, how to bear a pause, how to exit gently, how to be refused and stay whole. These were once taught not by lecture, but by living. Now the training ground has been moved, abstracted, flattened. We are left with protocols of avoidance where intimacy is negotiated through settings and presence is contingent on signal. But you cannot set a preference for revelation. It arrives or it doesn't, depending on what you risk in return. The shift is subtle. A generation does not declare that it has given up on approaching one another. It simply stops doing so. Not because it lacks interest, but because the rituals that supported those gestures have eroded. In their place are performances of certainty, bios, brands, assertions of alignment. But alignment is not affection. It is not even attention. It is a way of saying, I promise to surprise you as little as possible. But the best moments in any relationship are the ones that surprise us. When someone reveals an edge we didn't expect. When we see ourselves in a way we hadn't yet imagined. And so the question is not how to fix dating apps or revive chivalry or script the perfect introduction. It's how to make room again for that moment before the sentence, before the swipe, before the certainty. The moment when someone might say something wrong or not know what to say at all, and be met not with judgment but with patience, because in that space contact becomes possible, not just connection, not just consumption, but the slow improvisation of knowing and being known. We do not need to return to an earlier time, but we might need to remember something older than time, that to approach another person is not to seek an outcome, but to open a door, and to wait quietly, curiously, to see who steps through. There is a kind of wisdom that only emerges in awkwardness, not the kind we rush to smooth over, but the kind we endure together, unfolding in real time without narrative control. When two people meet without guarantee, something ancient stirs. Not instinct exactly, but invitation, the capacity to be rearranged by someone else's presence. In a world of ever-available interaction, this quality is startling and precious. It cannot be gamified. It cannot be scaled. It must be earned through attention, risk, and restraint. To approach someone is to momentarily surrender the illusion of self-sufficiency. It is to say, I don't yet know what will happen between us, but I am willing to find out. That willingness, once mundane, is now rare, not because people are less brave, but because bravery is no longer required of us in the same ways. We can express interest from a distance, confess attraction without exposure, signal desire with plausible deniability, and so the muscles of mutuality atrophy. We remain in orbit, curious, adjacent, untouched. But distance has a cost. Without the immediacy of face, voice, presence, we lose access to a kind of moral training, the unspoken ethics of attention. What it means to witness someone hesitate, what it means to hold back so they can come forward, what it means to say no without cruelty, or yes without certainty. These are not technical skills. They are human capacities developed through contact, mistake, forgiveness, and they cannot be learned through interface alone. Perhaps that's the deeper loss, not romance, but rehearsal. The quiet, everyday practice of relating, of misreading and then correcting, of speaking and then softening, of learning where the edge is by brushing against it, not by reading about it. These interactions are small, but they shape us. Without them, we become fluent in performance, but illiterate in presence. We know how to advertise ourselves, but not how to arrive. So the task is not to restore a past, but to recover a posture, one that leans forward gently into the unscripted, one that knows silence not as emptiness, but as opening, one that trusts discomfort as a teacher, not a failure. And in doing so, we might relearn the sacredness of the human attempt, the unfinished, unrehearsed, slightly trembling act of reaching toward another. Not with a guarantee, but with a willingness to be changed. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.